When we speak about prayer in Islam, many people think of it as a routine, something scheduled, something repeated 5 times a day. But the reality is far deeper than routine. Prayer is not simply a ritual, it is a moment of connection between the finite and the infinite, between the human being and his creator. And sometimes it is only one moment of true sincerity that changes everything. Think about the psychology of the human being. Most of us move through life distracted. Our minds are scattered between responsibilities, ambitions, fears, and endless noise. Even when we pray, our bodies may stand before Allah, but our thoughts may be somewhere else entirely. Yet there are rare moments of clarity when the heart suddenly awakens. A person stands in prayer and, for the first time in a long time, feels the weight of their own existence. They recognize their weakness, their mistakes, their need for guidance, and in that moment, the prayer becomes real. This is the moment that transforms a life. Islam teaches us that Allah does not measure our worship the way human beings measure actions. Humans look at quantity, numbers, appearances. Allah looks at sincerity. A prayer that lasts only a few minutes but is filled with humility and honesty can be more powerful than hours of empty repetition. When the heart is fully present, when the servant truly speaks to Allah, that moment carries a weight that cannot be measured by time. Throughout our lives, we often search for big turning points. People imagine that change requires dramatic events, some life-altering crisis, some major transformation. But spiritual change often begins in something far smaller and quieter. It begins in a single sincere moment. A moment where a person finally admits to themselves, I cannot do this alone, I need Allah. And when that realization happens during prayer, something profound takes place inside the soul. Prayer has a unique psychological power because it forces us to pause. In a world that constantly pushes us to run faster, achieve more, and worry endlessly about the future, prayer interrupts the chaos. 5 times a day, the believer steps away from the noise and stands before the one who controls everything. In that moment, the illusions of control disappear. The believer remembers that success, guidance, peace, and even the next breath all come from Allah alone. And when a person truly internalizes this during prayer, their entire perspective begins to change. The Quran constantly reminds us that Allah is near, closer than we imagine, but the tragedy is that many of us live as if He is distant. We make decisions, face problems, and carry burdens as though we are alone. Prayer corrects this illusion. In a sincere prayer, the servant realizes that the one who created the universe is listening to them personally. Imagine the psychological shift that occurs when a person truly believes that. Suddenly, hopelessness begins to fade. Fear becomes smaller. Problems that once seemed overwhelming start to feel manageable. Not because the problems disappear immediately, but because the believer now knows they are not facing them alone. History and personal experience both show us something remarkable. Some of the greatest transformations in a person's life begin in a single prayer. A person who was lost finds guidance. A heart that was hardened begins to soften. Someone drowning in despair suddenly finds hope again. All because of one sincere moment with Allah, and this is the reality many people forget. Your life does not always change through years of effort alone. Sometimes it changes in a single moment of honesty between you and your Lord. A moment where your heart finally speaks without distraction, without pride, without excuses. So never underestimate the power of one sincere prayer. Because the prayer you make today, one moment of true connection with Allah, might be the moment that quietly begins to rewrite your entire destiny. If we continue this discussion about the power of a single sincere prayer, we must address something that weighs heavily on many hearts, the burden of past mistakes. For many people, the greatest barrier between them and Allah is not disbelief, it is not ignorance. It is guilt. A person looks back at their life and sees years filled with wrong decisions, neglected prayers, broken promises, and moments where they know they fell far short of what Allah expects from them. And slowly, a dangerous thought begins to grow in their mind. They begin to believe that perhaps they have gone too far, that maybe their past is too heavy, that perhaps Allah will not forgive someone like them. But this idea is not only spiritually dangerous, it is fundamentally incorrect. One of the most remarkable aspects of Islam is the concept of divine mercy. Allah does not deal with human beings the way human beings deal with each other. When people make mistakes in society, those mistakes can follow them forever. A person's reputation can be destroyed by a single error, and sometimes society refuses to let them move beyond it. But Allah does not operate according to human limitations. Allah introduces himself repeatedly in the Quran as the most merciful, the one whose forgiveness is vast and whose compassion exceeds the imagination of his creation. And this is where prayer becomes transformative. Prayer is not simply an act of worship, it is a gateway back to Allah. Every time a believer stands in prayer, they are given an opportunity to reset their relationship with their Creator. The mistakes of the past do not have to define the direction of the future. Islam does not trap people inside their worst moments. Instead, it opens the door to renewal. Psychologically, this is one of the most powerful dimensions of prayer. Human beings need the possibility of redemption. Without it, guilt becomes paralyzing. When people believe their past cannot be repaired, they often stop trying altogether. Despair becomes an excuse to continue down the wrong path, but Islam refuses to allow despair to dominate the believer's heart. The Prophet taught that when a person sincerely turns back to Allah, their sins are erased, not reduced, not partially forgiven, erased, and the beauty of this teaching is that the door to that forgiveness is always open. Think about the implications of that. A person may spend years living carelessly, distant from faith, distracted by worldly pursuits. They may accumulate mistakes that they themselves struggle to count. Yet one night, perhaps in a moment of reflection, they stand in prayer and speak honestly to Allah. No performance, no excuses, just honesty, and in that moment, everything begins to change, because when repentance is sincere, prayer becomes more than a routine. It becomes a confession, a plea, and a turning point all at once. The heart softens, the ego weakens, and the servant recognizes their dependence on Allah. This moment of humility is incredibly powerful because it dismantles the pride that often keeps people distant from their Creator. And when that pride falls away, forgiveness becomes possible, but there is also a deeper philosophical dimension here. Forgiveness in Islam is not simply about removing punishment, it is about restoring dignity. When Allah forgives a servant, He allows that person to start again without being permanently defined by their past. The believer is not trapped inside their worst decisions. Instead, they are invited to grow beyond them. This is why so many of the greatest figures in Islamic history were not perfect from the beginning. Many of them had moments of weakness, mistakes, or periods of confusion. But what distinguished them was not perfection. It was their willingness to return to Allah sincerely, and that return often began with a single prayer. One prayer where the heart finally opens, one prayer where the servant stops pretending, one prayer where they say, "My Lord, I have made mistakes, but I am turning back to you." Never underestimate what can happen after that moment, because a single sincere prayer has the power to erase years of darkness and open the path toward a completely new life. And perhaps the most powerful realization of all is this: your past may contain many mistakes, but the prayer you make today can begin to erase them and reshape the person you become tomorrow. One of the most profound concepts in Islam is the relationship between destiny and supplication. Many people grow up believing that destiny is something fixed and unchangeable, something written in a way that cannot be influenced. Because of this misunderstanding, some people begin to feel powerless in their own lives. They assume that if something is meant to happen, it will happen regardless of what they do. And if something is not written for them, then no effort or prayer will ever bring it to them. But the Islamic understanding of destiny is far more nuanced and far more empowering than this simplistic view. The Prophet, let Hereafter, taught something remarkable, that nothing changes destiny except supplication. Think about the depth of that statement. It tells us that within the divine system that Allah has created, there exists a mechanism through which the believer participates in their own future. Dua is not merely an emotional act. It is not simply a psychological comfort. It is a real force within the spiritual structure of the universe. This means that when a believer raises their hands and sincerely calls upon Allah, they are not speaking into emptiness. They are engaging with the one who has control over every outcome, every opportunity, every turning point in life. From a philosophical perspective, this teaches us something powerful about human responsibility. Islam does not present human beings as helpless victims of fate. Instead, it presents them as active participants within Allah's plan. Our choices matter, our sincerity matters, and our prayers matter. Many times in life, we reach moments where we feel completely stuck. A person may struggle with financial hardship, personal failures, broken relationships, or uncertainty about the future. They may try every strategy they know, seek advice from others, and exhaust their own abilities, and yet the situation refuses to change. It is precisely in these moments that the believer remembers the power of dua, because while human solutions operate within limited possibilities, Allah's power operates beyond every limitation. What appears impossible from our perspective is simply another possibility within Allah's knowledge and control. Psychologically, this belief reshapes the way a person approaches difficulty. Without faith, hardship often leads to despair. People begin to believe that their circumstances define the boundaries of their future, but the believer understands something different. They understand that no door is permanently closed when Allah has the power to open it, and sometimes that door opens after a single, sincere prayer. We often hear stories where a person reaches a point of complete desperation. They have tried everything they know, and nothing seems to work. Finally, in a moment of humility, they turn to Allah with sincerity they have never felt before. They ask with honesty, vulnerability, and full reliance on their Creator. And slowly, things begin to change. Sometimes the change comes externally, opportunities appear, solutions emerge, circumstances shift in ways that were completely unexpected. Other times the change begins internally. The person gains clarity, patience, and strength they did not previously possess. Either way, the trajectory of their life begins to move in a new direction. This is the quiet power of dua. It does not always produce immediate results, and it does not always change circumstances in the way we expect. But it always has an impact because the believer has placed their request in the hands of the one who controls every outcome. And when a person truly understands this, their relationship with prayer becomes very different. Dua is no longer something they perform occasionally during moments of crisis. It becomes a constant dialogue with Allah. It becomes the place where fears are expressed, hopes are formed, and the future is placed under divine guidance. The believer begins to live with a sense of possibility rather than limitation. because they know that while human calculations may say something is unlikely, Allah's power is not restricted by human calculations. And this is why a single sincere prayer should never be underestimated. The moment you raise your hands and speak to Allah with honesty, you may be initiating a change that you cannot yet see. The circumstances of your life may appear fixed today, but destiny itself can begin to shift in ways only Allah fully understands. So never stop making dua and never assume that your prayer has no effect, because the prayer you whisper today might be the very moment that begins to transform the direction of your destiny. There is a particular moment in the day that carries a unique spiritual weight, a time that most of the world sleeps through. It is the quietest part of the night, when distractions fade and the noise of daily life finally settles. In that stillness, something extraordinary happens. According to the teachings of Islam, during the last portion of the night, Allah invites His servants to call upon Him. The one who controls every outcome, every opportunity, every moment of existence asks a simple question: who is calling upon me so that I may answer them? Think about the depth of that invitation. Throughout the day, human beings chase solutions. We speak to people, search for advice, and try to solve problems using our own limited knowledge. But during those quiet moments of the night, the believer is given direct access to the one who already knows every problem, every fear, and every hope hidden inside the heart. Yet very few people take advantage of this moment. Most people experience their deepest thoughts late at night. Psychologists often point out that when the world becomes quiet, the human mind naturally begins reflecting. Regrets surface, questions about the future appear. A person may think about their mistakes, their ambitions, or the uncertainty of where life is going. The night has a way of forcing honesty out of the human soul. Islam takes this natural moment of reflection and transforms it into something powerful. Instead of allowing the mind to wander in anxiety or regret, the believer turns that moment into a conversation with Allah. The quiet hours become a place of honesty, vulnerability, and sincere prayer. There is something psychologically profound about this. During the day, people often maintain a certain image. We speak confidently, we present ourselves as strong, capable, and in control. But in the silence of the night, those layers disappear. A person stands alone before their Creator without performance, without distraction, without the pressure to appear strong. And it is often in those moments that the most sincere prayers are made. Many people who have experienced major turning points in their lives can trace those moments back to a quiet prayer made when no one else was watching. A prayer spoken with complete honesty, a moment where the heart finally admits its fears, its weaknesses, and its hopes. When a person reaches that level of sincerity, something begins to shift internally, the ego softens. The heart becomes receptive to guidance, the believer begins to see their life from a different perspective. Problems that once felt overwhelming begin to look smaller in the presence of Allah's power. Despair slowly transforms into hope, and confusion begins to give way to clarity. But beyond the psychological impact, there is also a deeper spiritual reality at work. The last part of the night has always been a time when the most sincere believers turn to Allah. It is the moment when distractions are gone, and the heart is most capable of focusing entirely on its Creator. This is why some of the most transformative prayers happen at that time. A person might stand for just a few minutes, whispering their concerns and hopes to Allah. No audience, no recognition, just a quiet conversation between the servant and the Lord of the universe. Yet that single moment of sincerity can plant the seeds of change that reshape the direction of a person's life. The future may not change instantly, circumstances may not transform overnight, but something inside the believer begins to move in a new direction. Strength appears where there was once weakness, patience replaces frustration, faith replaces uncertainty. And from that moment forward, the person is no longer walking through life alone. So when the world becomes quiet tonight, remember that the silence is not empty. It is an invitation, because the prayer you whisper in the darkness when no one else hears you may be the very moment that begins to change everything. When we look throughout Islamic history, one pattern appears again and again. The lives of individuals often change not through gradual planning alone, but through a single, sincere moment with Allah. A prayer made in desperation, humility, or deep reflection becomes the turning point that redirects the entire course of a person's life. Human beings tend to think of transformation as a long process, and in many ways it is. Growth usually takes time, discipline, and effort. But the moment that begins that transformation is often surprisingly small. It is the moment when the heart finally turns toward Allah with complete honesty. Consider the early history of Islam. Some of the most influential figures in the Muslim community were not always the people we would have expected. Before their transformation, some of them were distant from faith, even resistant to it. Yet a single moment of sincerity changed their direction entirely. A powerful example is the story of Umar ibn al-Khattab. Before accepting Islam, he was among the strongest opponents of the message of Muhammad. His personality was strong, determined, and uncompromising. By all outward appearances, he seemed like the last person who would ever embrace the faith. But something remarkable happened. A moment of reflection, a moment of truth opened his heart. What began as resistance transformed into belief, and that belief transformed into one of the most powerful forces for justice and leadership in Islamic history. The man who once opposed the message became one of its greatest defenders. Now think about the deeper lesson behind stories like this. Transformation often begins internally before it becomes visible externally. Long before a person's life changes outwardly, something shifts inside the heart. A realization occurs, a sense of humility replaces arrogance, a desire for guidance replaces indifference. And, very often, this internal shift begins during a moment of sincere prayer. History is filled with these quiet turning points. A person faces a crisis and calls upon Allah sincerely for the first time in years. Another person reaches a moment of deep regret and asks Allah for forgiveness with genuine humility. Someone else, overwhelmed by uncertainty about their future, raises their hands in prayer seeking direction. From the outside, these moments appear small, no crowds witness them, no announcements are made, yet in the unseen world, something powerful is happening. A servant is turning back to their Creator, and that return carries enormous spiritual weight. Psychologically, these moments are powerful because they break the cycle of spiritual indifference. Many people live for years moving through life without deeply questioning their purpose. They follow routines, pursue ambitions, and respond to responsibilities without pausing to ask where their life is ultimately heading. But a sincere prayer disrupts that pattern. It forces the individual to confront deeper questions. Who am I really trying to please? What direction is my life moving toward? What kind of person do I want to become in the sight of Allah? When those questions emerge sincerely in the heart, change becomes possible, and once that internal change begins, the outward transformation often follows. The person becomes more conscious of their actions, more aware of their relationship with Allah, and more intentional about the choices they make each day. What began as a single prayer slowly becomes a new way of living. This is why the stories of transformation in Islam are so powerful. They remind us that guidance is not limited to a particular type of person. It is not reserved for those who have always been perfect or those who have never made mistakes. Guidance often begins at the exact moment when a person recognizes their need for it, and that recognition frequently happens in prayer. So never assume that your current state defines your future. Never believe that the person you are today is the person you must remain tomorrow. Because throughout history, some of the greatest journeys of faith began with a single sincere prayer. And the moment you turn to Allah with honesty may be the moment your own transformation begins. After reflecting on the power of sincerity in prayer, the possibility of forgiveness, the ability of supplication to influence destiny, the unique moments of the night when hearts open, and the countless stories of transformation throughout history, we arrive at a deeply personal question. All of these ideas sound inspiring when we hear them, but the real question is simple: what will we do with them? Because at the end of the day, guidance is not just about information. It is about action. Many people listen to reminders about faith and feel temporarily motivated. For a few moments, the heart feels softer, the mind feels clearer, and the desire to reconnect with Allah becomes stronger. But then life resumes its usual pace. Responsibilities return, distractions fill the mind again, and the moment of reflection slowly fades. This is one of the greatest challenges of the human condition. We often recognize what is right, but we delay acting upon it. We convince ourselves that we will change later when life becomes less busy, later when we feel more prepared, later when circumstances seem more ideal. But the reality of life is that the perfect moment rarely arrives. One of the most dangerous illusions people carry is the belief that they have unlimited time to repair their relationship with Allah. We assume there will always be another opportunity, another Ramadan, another quiet moment to reflect. Yet the truth is that life moves forward with a pace we cannot control. Every day that passes is a day that never returns. Islam constantly reminds us of this reality, not to create fear, but to awaken awareness. The purpose of these reminders is to help us recognize the value of the present moment. Because the only moment we truly possess is the one we are living right now, and that is why a single prayer can become the turning point of a person's life. Not tomorrow, not next week, not someday in the future, right now. Your next prayer might seem like one among thousands you have performed in your lifetime. The same movements, the same recitations, the same routine, but the difference lies in the intention you bring into it. If the heart is present, if the mind is aware, if the soul genuinely turns toward Allah, that prayer becomes something entirely different. It becomes a moment of decision. In that moment, a person can decide to stop running from their spiritual responsibilities. They can decide to repair what has been neglected. They can decide to approach life with a renewed sense of purpose and awareness of Allah. And sometimes that decision begins with something very simple: honesty in prayer. A person stands before Allah and admits their weaknesses. They acknowledge their distractions, their mistakes, their distance from the faith they know is true. But instead of walking away in guilt or despair, they choose to begin again. That is the power of a single prayer. It does not erase the past instantly. It does not magically remove every difficulty from life, but it establishes a new direction. It marks the moment when the believer stops drifting and begins moving intentionally toward Allah, and from that moment forward, every step becomes different. The prayers become more meaningful, the choices become more conscious, the heart becomes more aware of the presence of Allah in everyday life. What once felt like routine begins to feel like connection, all because of one sincere moment. So, as you leave this reflection and return to your daily life, Remember that the distance between where you are and where you want to be spiritually may not be as large as it seems. Sometimes the journey begins with something incredibly small, because the prayer you make next, the one you perform with sincerity, humility, and full awareness of Allah, may quietly become the moment that changes the entire direction of your destiny.